Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrived by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 210, we sit down with Bob DeLuca, president of Group for the East End, and one of the most influential voices in conservation on Long Island's East End. Bob's connection to the natural world began early, shaped by the landscapes and waters he explored growing up, and by a family history that ties him closely to this region. Before stepping into his long leadership role as Group for the East End, Bob worked across government and academia, experiences that helped formed his grounded, policy-driven approach to environmental protection. Over the past 3 decades, he has helped to guide the organization through major campaigns, protecting open space, advocating for cleaner water, and pushing back against development pressures that continue to reshape the North Fork. In this conversation, Bob reflects on how the East End has changed over the years, the victories and the challenges that have defined his work, and the community partnerships that make lasting conservation possible. We also talk about the lesser-known stories of environmental stewardship on the North Fork, what gives him hope for the next generation, and the biggest opportunities and obstacles ahead as the region continues to grow. So I hope you enjoy episode 210 with Bob DeLuca. This episode was recorded July 24th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really great to have you on today.
It's really nice to be here.
Thank you. And so, like with many of the other episodes, I like to start off with if you can give us a little intro about yourself and where you were born and raised.
Sure. So my family, my mother and father were both in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I was born in Bridgeport, and my mom was a librarian in the Bridgeport Library. My dad was a firefighter. We had moved up to Newtown and then later to Bethel, so I spent my elementary school and high school years in that area. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I went to Fordham University for my undergraduate work, and then I did my graduate work at the State University's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And I got out of there in 1985, and I have been here on Long Island ever since.
Mm-hmm. And just to go back a bit, even with your parents, how far back can you go with your ancestry, whether on either side?
Yes, so my father's parents were both born in Italy. My father's dad came here when he was 12, and the family story is he actually worked to stoke the fires at the Corning Glass Works back in the day. He eventually then, with my grandmother, I guess they had a farm in Maine for a while, which subsequently burned down. No insurance. They packed up. They ended up in Bridgeport. And he ended up as a mason, and he spent most of his life as a mason and then a hod carrier, which is the people that carry those bricks and those little things up and down 20 flights of stairs. Mm-hmm. On my mother's side, her parents were born here, but her grandparents were immigrants from Poland and what's now Slovakia, mm-hmm. and they were in Bridgeport as well. So my parents met each other at Seaside Park, which is the beach. If you take the ferry into Bridgeport and you see that nice little park to the left-hand side there, Seaside Park was a popular spot, and okay. And they met there. It's funny, my mother's dad wanted desperately for her to be a doctor, and he was sending her off to school. She decided to elope with my father at 19, so they went to Baltimore and they got married, and then tried to figure out life after that, which they did. And that's when he joined the fire department at some point in there. He went off and served in Korea, came back. And my mom got into the library business, and she was a real bibliophile. I mean, I think my mother read a book a week my entire life. So her house was filled, and she could recite. She was a good reference person, and she could give you chapter and verse of every aristocratic family in Europe and what happened. And mm-hmm. My brother picked up some of that too, but me not so much. And she was also a nature person. She was interested in nature. She had been to a Girl Scout camp in, I think somewhere like Monroe, Connecticut when she was a kid. And so she had the nature bug. And mm-hmm. she kind of gave me my first introduction to nature issues. when I was in the library with her, she would bring over these bird books and fish books and stuff, and I would flip through them as a kid. And I kind of get interested. And then when we moved from Bridgeport up to Bethel, in Newtown first for a couple of years and then to Bethel, there was a stream in the backyard. And most of my time growing up as a kid was back in those woods and in that stream. And that's where I really kind of, if you had that moment when you become an environmentalist, for me, that was really it. I mean, I just played out there as a kid, slopped around the stream with my dog. I mean, in some ways it was idyllic. But there was development kind of coming in all directions. And even then I was like, stuff living here. It's like living things. And I think that kind of stayed with me. And so when I went off to college, I was interested. I started out in biology, and then I got more and more interested into like, how do we get stuff done? And I kind of shifted into like environmental policy and biology. I created my own major at Fordham as an environmental science major. And then I found out that other people had done this. So when I went to grad school, there was an environmental science program there, which I took. But as a kid, I think I was really introduced to nature. Mostly by my mom. My father was not really an outdoors guy or anything. We didn't go camping or anything like that, but just bird watching off the back porch and spending time in the woods was a big deal for me.
And in high school, were you were gravitating towards science classes even then?
Yeah, I took a ton of science classes. I had good science teachers. I went to the local Catholic high school in Danbury, Connecticut, and the other nice thing about growing up there is even when you hung out with your buddies and stuff, there were certain places, Shelter Rock, Putnam Park. We did a lot of time, Macedonia. We would spend a lot of time in parks. And I don't know if that's the same or different now, but I mean, that's where we would go. So we would go hang out with our friends. And so it was kind of in the blood, going way back.
And so you mentioned going off to college, but coming out of high school, what were you set on that you really wanted to become?
So I wasn't really sure. I think I really wanted to know more about living systems. And the reason I went to Fordham is, if people don't know this, it's across the street from the Bronx Zoo and the Botanical Gardens. So people are like, why would you go to the Bronx to study the environment? Well, oddly enough, two of the biggest chunks of the environment that are left are right across the street. So Fordham University is on one side of Southern Boulevard, and on the other side is the Bronx Zoo and Botanical Gardens. And while I was there, I got to intern at the Bronx Zoo, which was very cool. I worked in the mammal area, worked with lions and tigers and elephants, and I was just trying to figure out how to. I think even then, and I kind of ran this little environmental club. I wanted to give voice to things that couldn't speak for themselves, which it sounds corny, but like something touched me that things were getting flattened and bowled over, places that I liked to go as a kid. And I always used to think to myself, when I started thinking more about on a policy or political side, like, what if you gave voice to those things, those living things? What if you gave voice to those trees? What if you gave voice to those birds? Like, what would the world look like? And I got very interested and kind of fixated on that. And then I was able to find a couple of professors who were of similar mind. And they're like, there is a way for you to do both of these things. And they had an interdisciplinary program there where you could, with the support of 3 faculty chairs, make your own curriculum around the stuff it's much more common today, I think. But back then, most of the people in the biology track were going to med school or something like that. And I was the oddball, and then during the internship stuff, I would be talking about yaks and, something I saw in a bear cage or whatever. And the other kids are like, okay, well. And at that time, Wall Street was very big. And I had other kids at the intern symposium was everybody who was having an internship. So they're talking about, mergers and acquisitions and arbitrage. And I'm like, well, today I worked with a pregnant lion and it was very cool. But it was interesting. I mean, I got to see, and of course the Botanical Gardens, again, if people have never been there, I mean, you're talking several hundred acres, just beautiful. And a lot of, you can see a lot of native trees that, you can't find many places anymore there. So I had that advantage, and, you could exercise, you could run there, you could do things. So that was how I ended up trying to, and then while I was there, I started thinking, okay, I'm clearly I don't know enough to really know what I'm doing. And one of my faculty members kind of aimed me toward, environmental science more as a profession, and that there were people who did this kind of thing for a living. And this is a God's honest truth. So I was graduating, and I was in the career office, and I was interviewing for some place to sell fake hips. I just needed a job. And God is my witness. I came out and I was kind of frustrated with this, and I slumped down in one of the chairs in this place, and a book falls off a shelf and hits me in the head. I tell my kids this story all the time. And it was the graduate course catalog for the College of Environmental Science and Forestry at Syracuse. So I'm like, huh. So I start reading through it. I'm like, oh, and they had a program there, which really was about policy and communications and sort of education and taking the science and converting it into something where people could understand it, and then converting that into understanding into change. Mm-hmm. And I was like, all right, well, you know what? It's destiny. I got to figure this out. And so I managed to get myself in there. And then once I got there, they really had, I could dig in a lot more deeply into, how do we take scientific information, convert that into public understanding, and work to make change. And, it ends up, there's a lot of ways to do it, but from my perspective, the kind of grassroots, bottom up, worked for me. Mm-hmm. And so I managed to, and then I worked with the National Wildlife Federation while I was down there, which is a very big nonprofit, but still a nonprofit nonetheless, and has a sort of, community centered. They have a lot of federated, it's like a federation of smaller offices around the country. Mm-hmm. Like I say, it's a big operation, but there is a certain smallness to it. And when I was there, I got to work up in the Adirondacks and work on the back of a lobstering boat going out of Nova Scotia to teach people about what came up in the lobster cages.
Yes.
So, a lot of cool stuff. And then the way I ended up here, and you may know him, Carl Grossman, who's an author and journalist, an environmental journalist in the region here, and I think he's recently turned 80 or something. But Carl had come as a guest speaker to one of the classes I was a TA for, an environmental communications class. And we got to talking, and I was just really interested in the work he had done. He had worked a lot on the Shoreham issue and issues related to all the problems around sort of, the idea of building a nuclear plant without an escape route and all this kind of stuff. So, we kind of stayed in touch. And then when I just kind of sent him, I guess back in the day, I must have called him. I didn't send him an email. And he said, hey, why don't you try this place called, at the time it was Group for the South Fork, now Group for the East End. Maybe they're looking for somebody. So I did. And at the time, my then girlfriend, now wife, was living on Long Island. And they were looking for somebody. So they hired me on, and I became an environmental analyst at the group. I stayed there for a while, and then we helped create an Office of Ecology at the county level. I went to the Office of Ecology as a biologist and then a senior analyst. And then I left there in 92 to come back here to the group as the president, which is like an executive director position.
Okay. But had you ever visited Long Island before that, even when you were in Connecticut?
I didn't. So this is the funny thing about people in Connecticut. People in Connecticut go to Cape Cod.
They're like, we're not coming over on the Long Island.
I didn't know. I mean, my experience of Long Island, I had a couple of guys that I lived with at Fordham who were from Long Island. So from Plainview west was what I knew of Long Island.
Okay.
And it terrified me. Like, it was very busy and there were lots of cars and noise.
Yes.
And I was really kind of a country kid. And then somebody, when I talked to Carl, he said, no, you'd be surprised. Like, So I came out and I was like, oh, it's very much more like New England here. Mm-hmm. And of course, the settlement from the north here is a different whole pattern of, colonial history. So I was like, well, I like this. And then I started finding, the Peconic Bay and the South Shore and all this stuff. I had no idea. And it's funny growing up because, here, I mean, everybody knows the beaches and Long Island. And I had been to Jones Beach. I shouldn't say I've never heard. I'd been to Jones Beach when I was in college. But I really had never been, like, say, east of Ronkonkoma.
Yeah.
And it really was like that feeling. I felt a lot like I was home because there's just a lot of similarities. Mm-hmm. So it was a good fit. And, there's so much, we exist ecologically. It's something called an ecotone here, where you're at the northern extreme of some things and the southern extreme of other species. And so we have this richness, plus we're along the flyway. So if you're a naturalist and you're like birding or whatever it is, I mean, you're going to find a ton of things, which is hard to imagine because if you just know Long Island is a very heavily developed suburban place, you really wouldn't think that you've got this concentration of threatened and endangered species that survive here. You have these archipelago islands that go all the way out from Fisher's Island to Plum Island. You have, you have bays, you have Long Island Sound, you have the South Shore bays. It's a lot here. Montauk, if you like, birding and that kind of thing. Whales.
Yes.
And I know for people that have never been, and I was one of them. If you tell people like I go to Long Island for the nature, people are like,
they're like, what?
Where
What
exactly is that?
about?
And then you get out here and you find,
Yes.
as I did, that it's a pretty wonderful place.
And around what year was that you first
1985.
1985. And when you first got involved with the East End, it was, you said Suffolk.
So it was originally called, it was called Group for America's South Fork, and then it changed to Group for the South Fork. And principally, the group it's a nonprofit. It's a membership-supported nonprofit that was focused on environmental protection, restoration, and a lot of the work was in the planning and zoning and land use decisions that essentially dictate what the place is going to look like when it's finished.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a kind of a unique niche in that area at that time. And as the region became more of a connected region, like the North Fork and the South Fork back when I got here, were much more disconnected than they are today.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the work that we were doing, Peconic Estuary is a great example. You can't really focus on half of the Peconic Estuary.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1985, when the first scallop die-off happened, we started getting involved in, protecting the bay,
mm-hmm.
which meant the North Shore and the South Shore there of that bay. And so over time, the organization, I think it was our 30th anniversary or something like that,
mm-hmm.
we said, we had somebody come in and take a look at us like on a strategic planning sense. And they said, I hate to tell you this, but you guys have been working on the North Fork for like the last 20 years. And
mm-hmm.
most people just think because you're Group for the South Fork, that must be the only place where you work, which makes sense. So we changed the name to Group for the East End, and we kind of embraced the idea that we really were looking at the place kind of as a bioregion, and so that the North Fork and the South Fork were ultimately connected ecologically,
mm-hmm.
and that we would try to take that approach. And that happened in 2007, 2008.
But what were you mostly tasked with when you first got in the group in the mid 80s? What were you working on?
So my first responsibilities really were planning, zoning, and land use.
Okay.
And we were tracking. The way it basically works is projects come into a town planning board or a town board or a zoning board, depending on the type of application. And we were, and ironically back to my childhood, in a sense, representing the voices that might not be heard in that discussion. If, if I'm a landowner and I want to build something, and then the staff might have an opinion, but, where's the opinion of nature?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where we were. And so for my first time at the group, I looked at car washes, I looked at 8-plex movie theaters, I looked at a variety of different land use proposals, and we would weigh in terms of what we thought was right, wrong, too much, not enough. And we focused on the need for land preservation at that time, which was going to become a major issue, because even though the towns were protecting land as they could, they didn't have a vehicle that was going to ensure sort of a perpetual stream of revenue to be able to compete with the development pressure that was coming. So eventually that culminated in something called the Community Preservation Fund, which we could talk about.
Yes.
But the idea was we needed a collective consciousness about those issues, and also water supply and water quality, right? So we drink from the water beneath our feet, which a lot of people don't know, and we don't have a reservoir someplace that we could put a fence around.
Mm-hmm.
So we walk on top of the reservoir here, and what we do on top of the ground finds its way down into the water. And when I came to the group, there had been a period of time where there was a lot of contamination coming from older pesticides that were being used in the agricultural industry, and there were a ton of private wells. So that was an issue for people. And we produced a booklet to help people interpret what is a well test when you get it back and you have 15 pieces of paper. What is it telling you? Like, what are we looking for? What are those analytes that we're looking for? What does that tell you? What does it mean to have too much of this? What are the standards for that? And we did a groundwater handbook as well, which helped people understand the water cycle here, and what happens on the ground and where it goes, and how it ends up right back in the bay. And all of those issues would come full circle when we got to the Peconic Estuary program, because it was the groundwater inflow to the bay that was causing some of the problems in the bay, because septic systems or fertilizers or pesticides or what have you, they don't just go away when they go into the ground. They eventually find their way back to the surface water, and all of that over time causes problems, as you can imagine. And there really wasn't a management strategy to know what to do about it. So the Peconic Estuary program, which started, it actually was finally approved by the federal government, I think, in 1993. But there was a period of time between 85 and 93 when we were like, okay, what are we going to do with this? And it was a good coalition of, baymen and people who, residential communities, municipal stakeholders, environmental organizations, trying to find out what was going on with the bays after the two consecutive scallop die-offs, 85 and 86.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually that work that the Suffolk County Health Department did, which came the first kind of management plan, was elevated to the National Estuary Program, became a nomination document.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason you want that is as a federal, I think there's 28 national estuaries. As a federal estuary, there's support that you can get from the federal government, state government's a partner, county government's a partner, now local governments are a partner. So again, it's a integrated funding stream.
Mm-hmm.
It's also an integrated planning strategy. And a lot of the work that's being done now on habitat restoration, water quality, these things all have their origin going back to the first scallop die-off, the big die-off in 85.
Mm-hmm. And what was I guess just even to focus on that scallop die-off, what were some of the main things? Was that with brown tide? Or?
Yeah, so it was kind of the first recognition of this brown tide, which was a species that was not known really to this area, and how it got here in such profusion and had this effect was an issue that people thought, we got to figure this out. And then it went away for a while. And then so it's always been, in some ways it was a harbinger. It's the precise reason why it bloomed that way when it did and had that dramatic effect is probably still a little unclear. But for 2 consecutive years, it essentially obliterated the scallop harvest and obviously the people that relied on that. And so that was enough to catch the attention of a lot of people. And even though after a while, and of course we have issues now that are slightly different, we know more about what's happening with the scallop population now with warming temperatures and not enough eelgrass for the young scallops to kind of cling onto, and parasites. So we know more now than we did then.
Okay.
But it really was the launch about, for the first time, it was like, we got to take this. If we don't do something about this, it's not going to get any better. And I think that really catapulted. And again, I think then land preservation efforts also protecting marshes and wetlands, many of which previously had been filled in or hardened in some way. So, a lot of what we do is obviously there's North Shore issues along the Sound and the ocean side as well. But I think that the Peconic Estuary is sort of like the heart of the region from an ecological standpoint in terms of the way you get the connection between the North Fork and the South Fork when you're thinking about the Peconic Bay.
Yes. And what about, you mentioned development and development pressures even in the 80s. Were you seeing that both on the South Fork and the North Fork at that time?
It wasn't as strong on the North Fork. I mean, my organization was formed around the end of the extension of the Long Island Expressway and the Sunrise Highway. When they both got to the east end, there was an awareness that very rapidly thereafter, which proved to be true, there would be a tremendous surge in development. And that surge first happened on the South Fork, less so on the North Fork. But it came, and I think since 2020, it's been more because a lot of people were sort of COVID refugees, and they came out here and they found ways to telecommute. And then there's a demand for additional services in a different route. You need more gas stations. I mean, it just comes with people. So how do you reduce that footprint, and how do you get ahead of it? So one of the first things my organization did long before my time was they had a foundation grant from the Whitehall Foundation, and it allowed them to start mapping, which sounds like commonplace today because of GIS and everything else. To map all of these sensitive resources. And then the theory was if you designed a land use plan and zoning around those resources, essentially if you came to look at those resources as your baseline infrastructure, water, right? How do we take care of water? And the economic vitality of keeping the region as a second home and tourist economy, fishing economy, agriculture, how do you look at all of that together and then decide what your land use is going to be? Now that I think for most people makes sense. Historically, it was kind of like, okay, here, my town is a square, and I'm going to put industrial stuff over there, and I'm going to put residential stuff over there. And if I have to fill in a creek or channel something to get the water, it was inverted if you thought about these natural resources as your basic infrastructure. So what my predecessors had done would be to try to change that discussion to say, look, we're probably not getting a big sewer plant out here anytime soon. We are not going to have urban infrastructure. It's too costly, and houses are too far apart. So how do we manage the region with the natural infrastructure we have, which, by the way, is cost effective over time, but even if that's not your concern, how do you not waste these assets in the development of your community so that you don't need more environmental mitigation over time because you've filled in a wetland that used to absorb floodwaters from a particular area. Now you have to figure out what to do with the floodwater, and now you have to build a channel, or you have to build a culvert, and you have to pipe something somewhere. If you could leave things alone, could you still have a viable community? And, there's a dynamic tension in all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we were involved in a lot of that early on. And to this day, it still goes on. What should we build? How should we build it? How much is too much? And what do you protect along the way to assure that not only just the identity, but that the natural integrity of these communities persists?
Mm-hmm.
And with issues like climate change and sea level rise, you have to be really careful when you think about, we're a sliver of sand 80 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. And you ought to think about that when you start planning what you're going to build where.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot of, regrettably, there's a lot of development and a lot of hazardous places, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about that. But you certainly don't want to make more.
Yes.
And, when the tide comes in and the water comes higher, you got to have a plan.
Yes.
And more that's, and tragically, of course, this recent issue in Texas, which is just awful.
Mm-hmm.
That's an area that knew they had a lot of flooding issues.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe you do something, maybe you don't do something. It's just easy to let stuff roll.
Mm-hmm.
And then something terrible happens, or can. Yes. And you hope that it never does. But, I was also here for, Hurricane Gloria and some of the other hurricanes that took a pretty big knock at this place. You need to think about these things as happening in real time, because they do. And it's just easier not to, but I think the theory is organizations like ours are trying to not just engage in fixing a project, but hopefully we're educating, and we have a lot of education programs that we do from school age to adults, help people understand where they're living. And if you understand the context of where you're living, even if it means you don't want to put Klieg lights up in your backyard so that, because there are consequences to lighting up the night sky.
Mm-hmm.
Just think before you act, right? Something your parents would have told you when you were 5 years old, but it's easy to not, right? You show up here, it looks nice, you buy a house or whatever. I mean, I don't expect everybody to get up every morning and open the pamphlet on how we live here. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, we need to know how to live here.
Yes.
Particularly if you like it and you care. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do. Many of the people that move here because it's beautiful and it's scenic and there's a beach and there's wildlife. So what do you do to protect those assets for your own enjoyment, quality of life, and for the integrity that they provide to the larger system?
Yes. And then now you've also mentioned time working with the group over a few decades now. How has it evolved over those decades since you've been here?
I think it's interesting. In the early days, we were not always welcome, and a lot of people thought thanks but no thanks. We've got an opportunity to really develop this place full on.
Yeah.
And we should.
We don't
need any bright ideas, At the same time, the issues were easier to explain. So if I had seen a 500-acre forest, like Hither Woods or something like that, or I had 600 acres of farmland, and the future of that would be a residential development with no farmland or chop down all the trees. From the public's perception, I think the issues were easier to see visually in a way. Mm-hmm. As time wore on, I think in general, the public, by and large, and I think this is even true nationally, considers the environment to be something of value. And that wasn't always the case. And as such, that we should try to find strategies to protect it for ourselves and also, I think, just, for the intrinsic value of having a healthy planet. So that's gotten easier. It's gotten easier to explain that these resources are important. It's gotten easier to explain that we rely on them, even though it may not seem so when we're in our car driving around. Where does the water come from? We drink that water. What are we putting on the grass on top of the water? Mm-hmm. Those issues were pretty easy. They've gotten easier because people are more open to hearing about it. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, the striking change between before and after was more dramatic. So today, I think there's a broader understanding of the importance of these issues, but the issues are far more complicated. because now you might be talking about a piece of property that's 10 acres
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't quite have the energy that 200 acres has. You might be talking about infrastructure like water pipelines and where should they go and where should they not go, or what kind of septic systems are we using? Because it's sort of like now that we're all here, we're drilling down more to the specifics of almost like a lot by lot analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, the sweeping terms was, build it or don't build it, preserve it or see it go under the blade. And so I think in some ways it's a more complicated discussion. I like to think that since we're still here and people still find this a worthy cause, that the ensuing generation of better understanding about the relationship between these resources and our own human health and our quality of life help the more complicated issues go down a little easier.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't go to a hearing now where I'm shouted out of the room, usually.
But that did happen.
Oh yeah, I had
in
been
the
in.
past.
Yeah. I had at one point I only had one police escort out of a hearing in my life, and it was regarding beach driving and plover protection. I'd say endangered plovers, and it was a pretty raucous hearing, and so there was some police there that said, "Well, just give you a walk to your car, just to be on." And nobody came after me. Nobody did anything, but they felt it was edgy enough that they should probably, so
Yes.
There was somebody once said years ago, welcome to the East End where land use is a full contact sport. And, it can be.
Yeah.
And, of course, the other thing is that as values go vertically, no matter what it is, and
Mm-hmm.
any scrap of land seems to be worth a skazillion dollars.
Mm-hmm.
People buy the land and they say, listen, I just spent $1 million for this. Like, I ought to be able to fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes I understand that, but also sometimes like, did you check the zoning, or did you realize there's a wetland in half of that property, which by law you're not really, and some people do, some people don't. So I think, that's in some ways a more complicated challenge these days.
Almost enforcing that, and whether we have restrictions on how big the house can be or how close you can build, we do have, with the property prices going up, we do have people with more money coming out here, which might say, well, I can just pay whatever fee and not have to worry about, or I can replant whatever or knock down whatever trees I want.
Yeah, and I think all the towns would agree that their capacity to do enforcement has been more and more difficult as well, because it's one, like if I'm looking at 100 acres of woods, I can tell you whether half of it got cut down. If I'm looking at somebody's deck on the back of their house and trying to determine whether it's 18 feet too close to a wetland, it takes almost as much time for a half acre of property, right?
Yes.
So I sympathize with those who are, the regulatory agencies, the building inspectors and people like this, because you're getting down to a very small level of detail versus, okay, the property is either open and developed, or open or undeveloped, or developed and it's going to be developed here or this way. So the best time you can protect property, if you can't buy it outright, protect it outright, and we should talk about that a little bit, is during the subdivision process. Because during the period of time that I didn't work for Group for the East End, I worked at the Suffolk County Health Department, and I was and my work there largely revolved around looking at hundreds of projects that were coordinated with the health department for environmental review commentary. So I would look at projects from Babylon to Orient Point, and we would prioritize the biggest ones, the ones that were the most concerning. And, it's a complicated process. And I think many times I saw proposals where, some part of somebody's backyard was going to be an easement that was going to be protected. 5 years later, all those easements disappeared. Nobody was able to enforce, it just didn't get enforced, and they get forgotten about. So as a basic strategy, if you want something to be protected, keep it outside a privately owned boundary. Because people will be like, well, I own this lot. I could cut that tree down. And, who's going to pull out their survey and be like, oh, wait a minute, And so, we made a big point of that in our commentary. But it also, of course, raises the issue of, you can't always mitigate everything. So sometimes outright land protection has been hugely important out here. And so whether you're protecting farmland so that farming can continue, And the way that that's done usually is through something called the purchase of development rights, where a farmer or an owner is paid the value of the property. Each development unit that they would have secured under zoning has a value, and they're paid for that, but the underlying property cannot be developed. It stays as farmland. The farmer can continue to farm it. So you get farming, and they get essentially the dollar value that the property is worth were to be divided. For open space or marshes or wetlands or other important parcels, essentially we wanted government to basically be in the real estate market so it could compete. So as there was more and more pressure, there were, how do we buy for the public trust these important pieces of property and a lot of sensitive areas here? How do we get that to happen? And so many of the towns had sort of floated individual bonds to do, some where they could. County got involved in the mid-1980s, sort of creating a county-wide open space program. But the biggest change really was something we call the Community Preservation Fund, which was approved by the voters handily. Several times it's been updated since. And that 1999 first approval gave each town an ongoing revenue stream that was generated by a flip tax on real estate transfers. And it's proven to have saved thousands of acres of land where the towns know they have a certain amount of revenue coming in. They're able to use that revenue to compete directly in the marketplace, to buy property for the public good, to open that property for parks or what have you. And that's been a real game changer. And our former assemblyman, Fred Thiel, was a huge part of that. And he's sort of the father of many great pieces of legislation around here. But that was one where he was a huge, not only a supporter, but obviously the author of that. And he pushed a lot of that along, and people, again, voted handily for it. And then most recently, just to kind of carry that forward, last November, there was a very big ballot proposition to create a water quality restoration fund. Also, Fred Thiel was on top of that bill. And so that was approved by 72% of Suffolk voters. So despite whatever differences may exist in the Suffolk voting community, everybody said, you know what, clean water makes a lot of sense. And that fund, which is basically generated by just an eighth of a penny in sales tax increase, will generate several $1 billion over the next 30 years for sewering projects up further west than us, but also to help people transition out their existing septic systems, which don't adequately treat nitrogen, which is proven to be kind of the priority concern in our, let's say, in the Peconic Bay and in our water, our coastal nearshore coastal environments. So that's been a great help, and it's just getting off the ground. But that's a 30-year ticket to better water quality. And all of these things, every one of them was approved by voters, which we think is critically important, because you want people to share in this concern. That I think it's important doesn't help. We need people to show up and vote and say, yeah, I want this. And that also keeps elected officials knowing that that's what the public voted for, and that should be a priority for them because they were told so, as opposed to like, well, we have some money here, maybe we should use it for this, maybe we should use it for that. So the idea is to put it in a place where the voters tell you what they want you to do with it, and then to sort of keep track of it to make sure that it's going where it needs to go. And from time to time, maybe it needs to get updated or something. But those programs, I would say, are of national significance. If you look at the amount of money that they're generating, the importance of them to the region, and importance to the economics of the region too, because if every one of those pieces of property got built or developed, what is special about this place would inevitably change.
Like you said, it is kind of one of the last areas on Long Island that looks similar to what it did even 40, 50 years ago, compared to when you talk with people from further west. They're like, well, this is what it was like maybe by Rocky Point or even further west. But I was wondering, just over your 3 decades working on the group for the East End, just it's probably hard to pick, but what were some of the most impactful environmental victories or campaigns you've been a part of? I
think it might be easier than it seems. So I would say number one is probably the Community Preservation Fund that affects all 5 towns, generates revenue for open space protection. I would say the Pine Barrens Protection Act. We haven't talked about the Pine Barrens all that much, but in the region, our Pine Barren, the Central Pine Barrens is the greatest reservoir of clean fresh water in the county. And that matters for the future because it can be a source of clean water. It also is an incredibly diverse and interesting ecosystem. And it is now the third largest forest reserve in the state of New York after the Catskills. So that's a 50,000 acre core preserve. That happened again in the late 80s, 1990s. That was, it started out as a sort of a contentious moment, but it ended up as a great success where there were a number of lawsuits filed. Pine Barren Society, we joined in some of that to try to get a plan for this wonderful area that was rapidly being developed. And so when it all shook out, the state of New York passed a bill that said we're going to have a forest reserve here, which is going to have a 50,000 acre core and about 50,000 acres of what we call compatible growth, which means you can build some things but not everything. And so we have that. I would say the Peconic Estuary Program is another one because it involves, again, all 5 East End towns. It creates a management plan and strategy and funding to try to deal with habitat restoration, to study some of the problems that we have and try to figure out what's going on and why, and also to spend a lot of time trying to educate people about, just what the Bay is, like we were talking before. I mean, those are a few of the really big ones, and I think you do this business, you think everything's important, you spend a lot of time on it. But all of those, and then going all the way back, I'd say to the 80s, the towns of Southampton and East Hampton dramatically changed the allowable zoning in their communities, what could have been developed. And it was changed to, you just couldn't have as much development as you might have had originally. And that was partially because of the focus on the fact that natural resources were essential to the quality of life and also the survival of the region. So that was another big one. I think those together, and then they sort of each have tentacles that come off them. But in my time being here, I think those were just game changers, incredible game changers.
Yes.
And have probably resulted, if you include the Pine Barrens, we're talking probably 150,000 acres altogether between the compatible growth, between the preserve, between all of the other land that's been protected in the 5 East End towns. And the easiest way to protect the environment is to just not mess with it in the first place.
Yes.
So these places are protected. Animals can live there. People can walk there. We have passive recreation. It doesn't put kids in the schools. Doesn't require police protection. Doesn't require roadways and shopping centers. So it takes down the pressure from a lot of things that aren't always easily seen. Yes.
And we've talked about development pressures, but just today I know Southold Town's working on their zoning update. And what do you think moving forward? Because I think it's still going to continue to be an ongoing thing every year, pressure. And do towns continue to do moratoriums, or how do they balance that with the need for whether people say they want growth, but then also protecting open space?
Yeah, the town of Southold has been at this for over a decade trying to get the plan right.
Yeah.
I mean, good for them though for reaching out to every community. I mean, they've spent more time trying to get community input, I think, than people understand. And now they're at the point where the rubber hits the road, which is you're going to need a zoning code to basically make real the recommendations that you put in your comprehensive plan. And it's always difficult because anytime you say we're not going to do this or you can't do this anymore, some folks aren't going to like it, and they're going to have to basically kind of hold firm on what they believe. Again, they developed this plan with the community input, so the broadest sector of the community participated. And we were a participant among tons of others, but we're not, we didn't write a plan for them. They wrote this plan. Citizens contributed to it. And this is true. The town of Shelter Island is doing a comprehensive plan. The town of East Hampton recently updated portions of its comprehensive plan to get rid of loopholes. And so there's a big move right now to kind of, and I think the story is this: the next 20 years to 30 years from this day forward is going to face a tremendous amount of pressure. There's going to be infrastructure concerns. We obviously have housing concerns to try to figure out. And if you get the plans going early enough, you actually have a chance to put the code in place that helps us to do what it is we all say we want to do. But it's like if I say I want to run the Boston Marathon and I never put on a pair of running shoes, I'm never going to run the marathon, right? So you got to take that first step. And it's hard. And I have a great deal of sympathy for people who are elected officials who have to try to balance all this. But I think the region has been pretty well united on this concept that I would say when I first started did not exist so much, where we get it. Elected officials on all sides of the political spectrum run on a protected environment. Everybody maybe interprets that a little differently. But you don't get elected out here anymore if you say, yeah, you know what, we should just pave the whole thing over. It'll be awesome.
Yes.
And I'll take that as a victory because that sets the stage for the smaller decisions over time that help you hang on to the region. And one of the reasons this region is so valuable is because it has protected parts of itself that many other communities have seen go by the wayside. So you do choose your future. And if you completely overrun the place and nobody wants to be here, it's not good for anybody. And so I think the main challenge is how do you balance short-term economic gain with long-term community interest? And a lot of times people will come in asking for stuff. I mean, I've talked to people in my own neighborhood who, arrived after COVID and they're like, well, where's like the local shop? Like, I never realized you guys don't have a shopping center out here. And I said, that's true. And that's okay. And we find ways we can. Yeah. And so, but it's a lot of work. And I think it's constant work also. I mean, it's never really done because somebody always has an idea and sometimes it's a good idea. Sometimes it's not a good idea. All the boards, the land use boards that make these decisions, these are regular people that have lives outside of doing that. And they're charged with this very big responsibility. So, we see it from our vantage point as the problems that are going to have the most significant impact on the town or the region. We need to be engaged and speaking as a voice for the things they can't speak for themselves. And also bringing, everybody that speaks on our behalf has an advanced degree in their field. And so that we're going toe to toe with somebody who might be up there saying, hey, listen, I know how to do this. Well, we have expertise as well. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the organization, which is they wanted a strong, educated, experienced professional team. And so you could not be kind of, pushed out of the way and said, well, a lot of people, that's nice. But, so we take that seriously. We try to build our staff in a way that the staff people have, we have, I'm the old timer now. Didn't used to be. But, I got people with 16, 18, 30 years experience. I mean, those people, they stay in it and they're just a wealth of resource. And also we're available to help people. I've had the people with property come in and see us and say, look, I have this property. Before I see you guys at a hearing someplace, what would you do with this if you were going to, like, where would I put the house? And some big projects have done that with us. Some smaller projects have done that with us. We're happy to do that. I'm not here to make anybody's life more difficult, right? It's the idea of what do you do on your property? Like if you are going to build something, what would you build? Or maybe you're not even sure if you want to build. Maybe you could sell it to the town. I mean, there are a lot of things that we can help facilitate. And oftentimes, I can't speak for everybody, I think people on the development side of issues sometimes are not as aware of what the sensitivities are as they might be. And they put together a plan and they work up all the details and they walk into town hall and they go to a public hearing and 100 people show up and say, this is exactly what we don't want to have here. And they're like, I can't believe this. I spent all this time and money and effort. And it's not always their fault. I mean, it's just kind of, they looked at it again, like a right in front of them and said, well, I'd like to put this here and that there. The public matters in these processes. And one of the things I'll say, we have a very good civic discourse in this region. I mean, there are parts of the world where nobody shows up and nobody writes letters to the editor, and that's not good for anybody. And I think we should all welcome the civic discourse, whatever it is. Let people come in and tell you what's on their mind. You as an elected official or an appointed official, it's data. And use that data and listen to what people have to say and why. And you can make your own judgment as to what you want to agree with or not. But if you obliterate the discourse and the discourse goes away and people feel that they don't have a say, I don't think anybody's better served. And if I was on a board, even if I had a different position than somebody at that podium, I want to know what's going on out there. And I'm not going to know if I'm just talking to myself and the two people next to me.
Yes. And then I also just wanted to touch on conservation and open spaces and even your thoughts on the farmland out here and vineyards, and obviously that transition in the 70s and 80s with the potato farms. Do you think farms and vineyards are doing their best in terms of having a low impact on the environment? Obviously, they might have to spray and then there might be runoff in the water, but are there other ways that they could improve on?
So I think in my time out here, there has been a significant improvement in the land management strategies that farmers can deploy.
Mm-hmm.
I think the vineyard industry. I mean, there's the Long Island Sustainable Wine Growers, which I think has really endeavored under Rich Harbich to, how do we have the least amount of impact? It's an industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Farming is an industry, and as such, it's going to have certain aspects of it that aren't going to always be, I mean, you're trying to make something grow. You're doing all these things, and it's not always going to be perfect. But I do think, I think the vineyards have basically tried to, to work on that quite a bit. Cornell Cooperative Extension has been working on different kinds of ag management strategies to kind of make it, make things a little more sustainable or environmentally friendly, if you will. I do think there's also, whether it's, there are different farmers too that are growing different things that require less, pesticide application. Many of the pesticides, and the farmers will rightly remind us that pesticides that they use were also approved for use. So many of the things that they put on the ground, somebody, whether it was the federal government or the state of New York, said, "Well, this is terrific." So whether it was Temic with potatoes, and it worked very well, but it was supposed to not be a groundwater contaminant until it was.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm sensitive to the fact that they can't be mind readers either, but I do think that there's been some progress. I also think a diversity of what people are growing, whether it's flowers or other things, vineyards and so on, may not need the intensive kind of spraying and all of that you saw with potatoes or some of the other, some of the other row crops. So I think the diversity of what you're growing, I think there is a younger generation of farmers who I think are more attuned to this. Like everything else, the consumers are also prepared to pay more for products that they feel were prepared with more protective of the environment, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a number of things. I feel pretty optimistic that'll continue to happen. Of course, there are side effects of every industry, and I don't think we should pretend that there's not. But I think we also need to understand that agriculture is expensive on Long Island, the cost of land and all of the other things that you have to do. And I think we try to be sensitive to that. We also try to have land use policy in place where, for example, buying development rights, where basically you may get paid the value of developing the property. Because a lot of farmers would say, look, if I can't grow potatoes this way, I'm going to have to sell the property. You guys would be screaming about that. Well, what if we could find a way for you to sell those development rights and be paid for that? And then the agricultural piece, maybe you could try a little better, try more experimentation with respect to more organic practices or more sustainable practices or no-till farming or all the different things that you're trying to do to make it a more sustainable type of. And I think the public gets that. I mean, if you take a look at the growth in the organic produce industry, which has been tremendous, and it's not cheap always, but people, if they can, are prepared to pay that. And I try to in my shopping to support that. But also to support local agriculture too. Like I'm very fortunate. I can walk from my house to Sepp's farm stand in East Marion. And I try to do it whenever I can because it's just a wonderful thing to be able to walk and buy your food where it was grown.
Grown within walking distance.
And it's fresh and it's, and you're supporting that farmer. So you're saying, look, we believe in you. We want to invest in you. If I'm going to tell you that I want you to work harder or do better at this, I'm also going to be prepared to spend money to support that. And I think wherever we could do that, I mean, if that's a message for people, buy locally, buy from farm stands, support local agriculture, that's really important. And I think that's a combination of things gets us to the best outcome.
And I'm curious with fishing and if you talk to some fishermen, they'd probably say there hasn't been fish or scallops within the bay since the 90s. Do you see that the waters are healthier, though, now? And then do you ever see that type of, not that industry, but just scallops and fish coming back into the area?
So some of the best information about the water quality, Chris Gobler at Stony Brook Marine Science Center has been doing a really close analysis of all of these issues for a very long time. And his data was, I think, instrumental in some ways in helping to raise awareness about the need to deal with our septic waste. So by and large, the septic waste, except for, and there are some areas we have nitrogen gets into the bay through the atmosphere, nitrogen gets into the bay from runoff, nitrogen gets into the bay from agriculture. But if you look across the entire estuary, our septic waste is a principal culprit here. And so we have to start, and we have now new systems that are approved. We're getting rebates to help people pay for changing out their systems. And that, as of last November, we finally had a recurring revenue stream. So it's going to take some time. The health of the bays from west to east, it's the least healthy in the west. And part of that's because of flushing and the shallow nature of the bay there. Warms up the water, holds less oxygen. By the time you get out further to the east of Shelter Island, the water quality is doing better. Overall, however, water temperatures are coming up. Eelgrass is sensitive to presence of nitrogen. Temperature is going to probably be an issue, right? And so we're, I don't want to say 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but our forward progress needs to catch up with the problems that we have. If you're losing 80-90% of your eelgrass beds, you won't have scallops setting on their own. Now, there's been a lot of work with oysters. And when I first came here in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of oystering going on. Now there's been investment in, oysters and and shellfish hatcheries and all of that. And that's done pretty well. They obviously are filter feeders. They help to clean out the water. They help to, so these are complicated systems and they take time to heal, but they do heal. And I think once we get moving on the septic changeouts and people are supported in their efforts to do that, that can be a game changer. Because again, if you look at Suffolk County Health Department spent several years doing this sub-watersheds wastewater plan. They looked at every sub-watershed in Suffolk County and figured out the nitrogen contribution and all those issues. And we have a lot of work to do to be able to get those nitrogen numbers where they ought to be. And as we're getting those nitrogen numbers down, we also have to confront the idea that the waters are probably going to be warmer, which means the oxygen that they hold is not going to be as high. So, but the bottom line is, let's get the nitrogen out. Where we can, let's start to restore habitats and areas that help clean water that comes in as runoff. Let's get rid of road endings that just dump all of the water in a rainstorm from a road right into the bay. And there's a thermal impact as well. And just keep better land use practices, buffers between the marsh and surface water. Let's not build every house as big as we possibly can make it so that the runoff has nowhere to go except to go over it. So there's like 8 or 9 different practices that you can do while you're also saying, all right, the biggest issue here is going to be this nitrogen issue, but there's other stuff we can do as well. So my feeling is that the health of the bay has great potential to improve. There are some areas of the bay that are in pretty good shape now. The western bays are in the roughest shape, and a lot of that has to do with something that we now have the tools to try to fix. So I feel pretty optimistic. I mean, I've been at this for a long time, and I should maybe think I'll be more cynical about it. But I look around, and in my career, there's the Pine Barrens Preserve. There's thousands of acres of open space protected under the Community Preservation Fund. There's an estuary program that's been out there trying to solve some of the complicated issues in the 5-town region. I mean, yeah, but I'd love it all to happen yesterday. But the bottom line is, and by the way, none of this happens unless people care. So you've been at this long. What I know to be true is that over the last 35 years, people in this region have continuously voted to tax themselves to pay for change to get a healthier environment. Yes. And those numbers are always strong. That's not bad. And I think we need to, when you're in the trenches a lot, it's hard to remember that. But we need to remember that none of this would happen unless the public was saying, you know what, like, we could do better here. And that supports Chris Gobler's research. And that supports a politician who says, what do my constituents want? And that supports the ballot referendum that we had last November. And that supports the future of the Pine Barrens Protection Plan. So as long as people are on board with this and they do start to see change, real change over time, I think we're in about as good shape as we could be given where we are as a people at this time in history.
Yes.
It'd be a lot easier if 90% of the open space was still here.
Yes.
But it is what it is.
Yeah. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on, it seems, the Suffolk Water Authority pipe project. It seems like when I talk to people, it seems like they're kind of in between. They're like, I'm not sure if this is good or this is bad.
So we actually just wrote to the Water Authority. We gave them a comprehensive package of what we thought they should be looking for in doing this environmental analysis, which is required for this project. Mm-hmm. So the short story is that the water supply in Southold has been overused. Mm-hmm. And according to the Water Authority, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, as much as 70% of the drinking water that we produce for people is going up through irrigation systems. Mm-hmm. So if we were not irrigating our front lawns all the time, we would have more water. The existing system that they have, because it's being drawn down, there's about 60 wells in the town of Southold. And the reason there's so many wells is because we don't have a lot of fresh water in this area before we get to salt water. Mm-hmm. So you can't put a well down, 400 feet like you could in the middle of the Pine Barrens. So the Water Authority is vested with the responsibility of managing the public water throughout the town, and they've done it in a variety of different ways, and they've connected up systems that weren't connected. Mm-hmm. I live in a subdivision that had its own little community well field, and the Water Authority took that into its system. They have their own wells. They're using, it is a complicated hodgepodge developed over many years. Mm-hmm. And by and large, the Water Authority truly provides, good, clean, tested water, and I have no ill will toward that. Mm-hmm. When you bring in infrastructure, could be a road, could be a water pipe, there is a tendency for people to say, water is not a limiting issue anymore. So why can't I now build fill in the blank? Because I have enough water. Because one of the issues is always, listen, we don't have a lot of water here. You may not have enough water for this project. We don't want to be, shorting ourselves even further. So one of the risks is what's called a growth inducement, which is, does bringing the water pipe here create a scenario under which there's going to be more inducement? And so one of the issues that we asked them to look at is, how exactly is the water that you're bringing in? And by the way, the water that they're bringing in is coming from Flanders. They have a well there. They have excess capacity in that part of their system. Mm. And this is essentially a transmission line, which takes that water and brings it all the way here. Now, to get here, they have to go under the Peconic River. They have to go under Sawmill Creek. It's not an easy project. I don't believe they would do it unless they thought they really had to do it, because it's like a $40 million project. They are telegraphing that they're having a problem meeting demand. So my feeling is, one of the things, whatever the outcome, as a town, the town needs to also step up and say, what are we going to do if 70% of the water is going, what are we going to do to help better manage irrigation? What are we doing to tell people that there's a problem in the first place? Because the Water Authority is like, well, we have a water alert out there. I don't know anybody who knows that it's out there, right? I mean, so there is that disconnect. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we asked for is that the Water Authority to create kind of a joint task force with the town and say, all right, look, we all have, doesn't help anybody to just keep burning up water, even if we have water in Flanders today. Is that the best strategy? Now, we may have to use that water because the system won't work without it, but we shouldn't just be callous about saying, well, we have the water, so let's forget about everything else. We really need to do the everything else. So it's a multi-step project. This analysis that they're doing should be looking at what is the potential for growth inducement and how do you restrict that? In other words, don't make the town's zoning job any harder. At the same time, the town needs to say, what are we doing to help our residents better conserve water, know that there's a water problem, crisis, that there's and if we're not doing that well enough, we shouldn't just point the finger at the Water Authority for bringing us more water. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I've advised the Water Authority, work with sit down with the town, see what you all could do together here, because you shouldn't be taking this resource from Flanders and running it out here so that we can send it up our irrigation systems. That's not the best use either. I don't say it's easy, and I'm not saying there's a magic bullet here. But what I'm trying to foster is a dialogue between the two entities that have the most to do, and one would be the Water Authority and the other is the town. And as part of the town's comprehensive planning efforts, they talk about water conservation. Mm-hmm. So how can they, and it's another example, so the Water Authority may own property out here that they may not need if they run this water pipe, shouldn't that go into a protected lands program so that it's not going to be necessarily built and require more water?
Mm-hmm.
But try to look at other strategies and other mitigation measures where if you're going to have a water pipe like this, you also know that you're not just turning on the spigot and just hoping for the best.
Mm-hmm.
Like you really need to manage, and I know it's annoying, but you really need to manage these resources from the beginning. If 10 years from now there are problems, it's always more expensive to fix them then.
Mm-hmm.
So let's deal with it. The other issue is a portion of this pipe is going to come through Riverhead Town. And people in Riverhead Town who are concerned about the development of properties on the north side of the North Road there. And you may remember there was this whole issue about an agri-tainment district, and
yes.
it was a big challenge.
Yeah.
So I asked the Water Authority to explain the difference between it and the Riverhead Water District and to explain how, if or if not, there's any way for that pipe to be drawn off into these areas that people were concerned about for growth inducement along the North Road. So they've got to take a look at that. And if they do all this the right way and it's, and the public gets a chance to look at it and it's evaluated and the town, in my view, the conservation issue needs to be embraced by both entities, the town and the authority, and we need to find a way for that to be an ongoing working effort to help people deal with this issue. I don't feel comfortable just opening up the spigot from Flanders and saying, okay, well, we got problem solved. We've got to do better than that. I mean, if that pipe ever breaks going under the Pecana, and then what do we do? That's, and the other thing is that their position, which I believe to be true, is that we're not adding more water to the system. We're simply providing the water that the system currently is using. We're not adding, but that may be true to just keep the pressure where you need the pressure. But if you keep adding along the way, well, that pressure, you're going to need more water to service more areas, and then it will require more. So let's just make sure we know what we're doing before we do it, that we've thought about what the potential issues might be, and that we've collaborated to make sure that we respect and understand the need for water conservation, even if we have a big spigot of water that we could just turn on. Like, we have to do better.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to believe that although I've heard this elsewhere, I mean, it's true. It's just amazing that we would be sending so much of that water up to sprinkle our lawns.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, my house that I bought has an irrigation system in the front yard.
Mm-hmm.
And I use it like twice a month or something like that. It doesn't have to go every day. And it doesn't have to go, every other day. You'd be surprised. And we get these big rainstorms. And sometimes, your grass dries out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a lift. But I think that the discussion needs to happen. I think it's starting to happen. I will give the Water Authority credit for showing up and doing a number of public outreach efforts. Mm-hmm. That's a good start. I hope it carries through in the end, and we'll see what comes out of it.
And then didn't you mention the town needs to do its own work? And did they pass some irrigation? So
they had the hearing on the irrigation law, which we supported.
Okay.
I don't know if it's been. I don't think it's. I think it's going to pass.
Okay.
I don't know if it specifically passed just yet.
Okay.
But I think that is something, right? That's a start.
But like you said, it's not good to just say, oh, well, we can just divert water from Flanders. And like that seems somewhat of, not a Band-Aid, but just that we need to really focus on why we're using this much for irrigation. And
yeah, like that's an important issue. And that's an issue at the local sort of planning, every single, where I grew up in Connecticut, I didn't know anybody who had an irrigation system. Like that's like a thing that I only learned about since I live here.
Mm-hmm. And
I don't know, we had a lawn. It wasn't a great lawn, but it was a lawn. And, I respect that people want to have the lawns that they want to have, but I just think something tells me we could do a little better than sending 70% of it up the stack. Like a lot of things, when you educate people about what the consequences are, or that there are consequences, or that maybe this is not just the most sustainable way to do something, once people know that, I think they do better. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get everybody, and a lot of people are going to be like, what, I'm going to do what I want to do. But most people are like, I'd like to have enough water. Like, I don't, and it does occur to me that if I have to get it from Flanders to service me in the middle of Southold, that seems like a little tenuous. Like you have a major hurricane or something and it breaks
Yeah.
And then what do you do? And I understand and I used to work at the health department with a lot of engineers. Engineers have a way of looking at things, which is a very, analytical. They know where it's going to go. They know how to put it in. They know how to build the pipe. Biologists tend to work more within the constraints of nature and the old, if anything can go wrong, it probably is going to go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's say you buried a pipe under the Peconic River and that pipe has been pushing water to Southold because it needs it for a very long period of time. And then something happens. Like, what does that look like? And I actually asked them to look at or to explain, is there a sleeve that pipe goes into? Is it like what, stuff breaks. So how's that going to work? And what happens if and when it were, or even if it was for maintenance purposes, had to be shut down?
Mm-hmm.
You just got to make sure that you've kind of thought about these things or crossed the T's, because listen, it's a big project for them. And I do think they wouldn't do it if they didn't really feel like they have this need. I also feel like a lot of things, then you do it and you move on to the next crisis. They got plenty of stuff to work on. So it's just, we are a little bit like the Greek chorus. We just try to chime in from the sidelines about things you might want to think about, and hope that we're wrong. But life being what it is, forewarned is forearmed.
Yes. And I think we've touched on this a bit, but you've talked about your hope for the future of the region, and so far people have been, I think, active in some ways with, like you said, taxing the town and to preserve the area. But just looking at the next generation of environmental leaders, what gives you hope about them and the North Fork region?
So it's kind of a mixed bag, because I still feel, and I taught at Southampton College for a number of years.
Okay.
And one of the things that I think we still miss from an educational standpoint is I inhabit this world between scientific understanding and public policy, and the confluence between those two things, and how do you shape policy. And then the day-to-day, pick up the phone, call this person who knows that person, see if you can get a cup of coffee with somebody. All of that kind of networking stuff, like in some ways people can connect to everybody through the internet, and in other ways you don't connect to anybody. So like, to me, it's, and I'm a dinosaur, but it still matters to me to go grab a cup of coffee with somebody, or to check in by phone and just say, hey, did you see this thing? And what do you think about that? Those are very important skills in this business. So I think it's very important that people understand the community component of any environmental change, or even sustaining environmental change. And there are some young people that I'm working with, kind of mentoring right now, that argue the same thing. And some of them have natural science degrees, some environmental degrees. And I know them through different programs. They're young professionals in this business. And they will say, like, whatever you old timers do, and I think of, Adrian Esposito, whose name you may know from the Citizens Campaign for the Environment, Kevin McDonald with the Nature Conservancy, we're all in a similar demographic. And we came up doing those kinds of, like, how do you go talk to this person? How do you call that person? Checking in, doing all of this kind of sideways networking with people. And it really, really matters. And I just don't know that we've given it the importance we need to give it when we're training people to do environmental work. So I have some concern about that. I'm also concerned that young people, because of the barrage of 360-degree wall-to-wall negative everything about the world and climate change and what's happening, that you just do something else with your life. Like, you just avert your eyes. And, I've known people in this business that lasted for 2 years and they were like, I can't, many people who cared deeply. So we have to be able to focus people on success. We have to be able to focus people on the good that can be done. You can't do everything. And I don't know if we're going to do well enough. But it's also like above my pay grade to figure out when the earth ends. And I'm okay with that. I just think that hope is in short supply. And I think hope and this interface with people is really needed. I do believe there are many talented young people who are advocates for environmental change and sustainability. But I think we do them a disservice by not sharing. And actually, one of these people she's like, you cannot, like, ditch get out of here unless we start to know what you guys know about how do you do this. And it's just not it's not a straight line. So I think we have an obligation to those young professionals to spend some time with them and let them make their own decisions, whether they think we're crazy or not. But there's a yearning for that. And there's also a yearning for hope. And it makes me terribly upset. My own kids, my kids are in their 20s. And I see the lack of hope. I mean, every time they turn around, they just are like, you pick the issue. And that can be debilitating. And I think it's like a lot of things with information. On the one hand, the information we have access to is miraculous in some ways and allows you to see things you could never see or find things you could never find or very rapidly put together a legitimate, well-researched piece of information. And at the same time, it is so burdensome to just be blasted with negative imagery about, again, you pick the topic. And young people they have anxiety, they're burned out, they're depressed. I get it. That'll happen. And I worry that they may give up and not feel like this isn't just, a quixotic effort to. So I don't know.
I feel like at least there was, I think, some momentum in the 2000s and 2010s. I think it has kind of, like you said, with a lot of the information, a lot of other issues coming to the forefront. I don't know if climate change and the environment has taken a back seat in some way to other issues going on today.
It's interesting. I look at climate change sometimes and I think to myself, it is such an existential crisis that if I'm an average person who doesn't want to spend my entire life doing environmental work, but maybe I'd like to be an environmental leader in my community or at my school or whatever. Some of the where you have to get to in the headspace to understand, like, the trading of, carbon credit, you pick. Whereas if you understand the link between how you manage the ground around you and the impacts that has on the climate, better and worse, you might be able to pick something and get something done. But I do think that young people are also inundated with climate change as an existential threat for which what could any one person ever possibly do about the entire planet? And that's a really fair question to ask that those of us in the business need to think about. Because we need to help people understand that the smaller, it took us a long time to make this mess. And this mess was made largely by millions of individual decisions over time. I suspect, as frustrating as it is, that's the road home. Lots of small decisions made in communities across the globe, which start to, hopefully with enough time, to push us back in a way where we don't, go over the tipping point, which a lot of people feel maybe we already have. That's got to be the work, because not everybody's going to work in the international field of climate change. But every single town, every community that puts in a buffer and does a rain garden or stops runoff or prevents some, puts in more trees or does something to sequester carbon, or you figure it out. Those are all tangible, ownable, appreciable, identifiable things that you could do. Like when you asked me before, I can drive by the Pine Barrens and I could say I had a tiny part of doing something about that. I can look at land that gets protected and say I had a tiny part of something doing something about that. I can look at, the parks that I go to frequently, like in Orient. And back when I was at the county, and the county was a contributor to buying Orient Point County Park, and I was part of that tiny part of that, keeps me getting up and doing something. And if I can't find one of those, how do you do it? I mean, I really, it does concern me. And I think we got to start giving some positive help to people to let them see on the ground the value of the work that they're invested in. Because if they don't get it, it won't be their fault, but why would they stay with it?
No, I think that's important. Like you said, grassroots kind of ground effort within the area. You see impacts locally, whether instead of focusing on the bigger picture, you need to make sure even just where you're living, you're working to improve the environment.
There's a book out there by Paul Hawkins called Drawdown, which you may have heard of, but I was introduced to it by Dorothy Riley and Mary Morgan from Mary Morgan here in the North Fork, which essentially takes climate change and breaks it down into like 50 or 60 different actions that can be taken to support cooling the climate in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So whether it's wetlands protect, I mean, it's just, and I look at that book kind of as, to me, as the Bible of how do we, because there's an organization working locally on environmental issues. We're not like a climate organization. But are we looking at our priorities through the lens of climate change? In many cases, I've surprised myself that some of the stuff we're working on is part of the stuff in that book. So, that's a good example. And I imagine Hawkins and they understood that, which is we're not all going to be at a climate accord, in Norway or someplace. Like we're going to be in our communities. And what can we do here? What thing can we do? And a lot of these things are tangentially related, but they all matter. So I favor that approach. And I would urge people to take a look at this book, Drawdown, because I think it's understandable, digestible, and you can read it in parts. And it does give you a sense that, wow, because I know I could work on that thing right there in my town, and I don't have to get involved in the bigger issues so much. I think that's important to people, like small success over time. And it's up to forces higher than me to decide whether we get it done, but we're getting something done.
Yeah.
And that does matter. I mean, it's not insignificant.
No. And now for the group for the East End, we've talked about a lot of issues, but moving forward now, are there any projects you're excited about that you're working on that you might come to?
Well, I'm really excited about, we finally, as of November, got, in March, the Suffolk County Water Quality Restoration Fund started collecting its first revenue. And so by the end of this year, the logistics of who and how and why and how to make that program work and getting, I'm really excited about that because it was a 15-year effort to get us here. Right now, we're also trying to support efforts to protect the federal funding for the estuary program, which all the estuary programs recently, the president wanted to cut funding for there. So we're working on that. I feel like the turnout and the support has been good. Been very bipartisan support as well in the East End here. So so it's just really a question of just keeping that momentum going. We've been working on a horseshoe crab protection bill, which passed both houses in the state last year, but was vetoed by the governor. It passed again this year. And so we're trying to work to see. And the short story here is obviously people who follow this, horseshoe crabs have been declining significantly. This is a creature that's been on the earth for over 300 million years. Principally in our area, they're used for bait, for eel and whelk. And the numbers are not good. There's scientific evidence that the numbers are not good. The state has taken a more wait and see approach. The state of Connecticut has a ban on harvesting. New Jersey has a ban on harvesting for bait. And we're just trying to make sure that we haven't put a target on Long Island to say we're the only guys left. And see if that doesn't, create a larger problem for people coming to get the horseshoe crabs. Now, why is that important? Well, horseshoe crabs also are a symbol, really, of the region, and also they're part of our coastal ecosystem. If something lived 300 million years, I really don't think we should be taking it off the map.
Yes.
And I recognize that there may be an environmental or an economic impact there to some of the fishermen, and I think that's worth taking a look at. I mean, whether you can try to offset that is worth considering. But at the end of the day, there again, you have a bill that was passed by both houses of the legislature, including, locally here, Tommy John Schiavone on the South Fork voted for it. I think that's a bill that we hope the governor will reconsider this time around and maybe, just let the horseshoe crabs be for a while and not risk their extinction.
Yes. And I think just lastly, you've talked about what you've enjoyed, but I guess even just looking back at your career and today, what have you enjoyed most about living and working on the North Fork?
So it was interesting. When I worked at the National Wildlife Federation, which was a really cool operation, I never really felt like I touched any of the stuff that I did certain things, but I felt like the work of the organization was much bigger than me. And again, I was a graduate intern or whatever. But here, I run into people in the grocery store that know a project that we're working on and may want to share something or tell me a story, or I get phone calls. I kind of like that. Like I never thought much about that. And like I said before, I can drive by something and I could tell my kids, especially when they were little, Dad helped do something to make that happen. That feels good. And even if the rest of the world falls apart, I can still look at Dam Pond, or I can look at Orient County Park, or I can look at some pieces of property that have been preserved in the estuary watershed and be like, all right, I'm just one dude. Like I wanted to do something. I wanted to try to help nature. I wanted to give it a voice. And through the course of my career with limited capacity as a human, I did some of that. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you a funny story. I worked at a hospice when I was in college as part of a class. And I talked to people who were on their deathbed. And I paid very careful attention. By the way, it was that experience that got me to go back and change my major. Because what people think about, at least the people that I spoke with, all of whom were wonderful, was whether or not the time you spent doing whatever it was you were doing had some purpose. I mean, I heard that over and over again from people.
Yes.
And I took it to heart. And I was like, even when I got into this, like I had no idea what business I was getting into, but I was like, that stayed with me. I would say it haunted me in some ways. Mm-hmm. So, I'm looking toward the end of the tunnel here, not getting any younger. And I want that to be, and I told my kids this too. I said, listen, the last thing I want to be is like sitting on my deathbed with you guys, like clocking time while I'm whining about what I didn't do with my life. Mm-hmm. I really wanted to do this. And I did some of it. And with the help of lots and lots of people, not to mention the people that support my organization and every one of my staff members. But I think it mattered. Mm-hmm. And I'm good.
Yes.
Like at the end, that's all you got. The money doesn't go with you. The friends that you have, you're going to leave behind. The only thing you have in your soul is your soul. And whether or not the time you spent mattered to somebody. And it could be the tiniest thing. But if it mattered to you and you did it, to me, you won.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then were there any last minute things you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't touched on, or even just if you want to say how people can get involved even with the organization?
I mean, I would, the group.org is a pretty easy handle. So just look up the group.org. You can see what our initiatives are, see what we're working on. Uh-huh. We are a community supported organization, and that allows us to keep a lot of objective integrity in terms of we're not really wed to anything other than the interests of our membership. Mm-hmm. I would encourage folks just to learn more about the group. And if you want to get on our mailing list or learn, we do action alerts about things that we're working mm-hmm. on. We're on social media and all of that. So I think that's important. The other thing is, I know when I speak like this, I don't want people to think like, oh, this guy, like with the roses and hearts and flowers, like it's oh so wonderful. It's hard, man. It's hard to do, but it's good to do. And so mm-hmm. if you understand that going in, you will last doing anything. We should strive to have a life that makes a difference somewhere and whatever. It doesn't have to be the environment. But we should also know that it's not going to be all hearts and flowers and roses. But when you really think about it, when you add it all up at the end, right? I mean, the hardest won victories are the ones that you remember. And like if this was all easy peasy, one, we would have done it already. Mm-hmm. And two, I don't know that I would feel like I had to put my shoulder into it to get it done. So I think that does matter. And I think people shouldn't be afraid to try. And they shouldn't be afraid to think that, nobody's going to listen to me. I mean, we have no authority. I don't regulate one thing on the planet Earth in my organization. But we believe that the voice that we bring to decision makers has made a difference and will continue to do so with the support of our membership. So these systems, democracy is what it is, but these systems can work so long as you keep believing in the methodology of organizing your thoughts, putting a reasonable position together, sharing that position with others, bringing in stakeholders, and at the end of the day, speaking from your heart, but with solid information about what you believe, whatever it is. And mm-hmm. I would encourage everybody to do a little bit of that. And whether you're a young person, old person, it feels better than it does bad. Mm-hmm. And I'll take it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and having this wonderful organization that you're running, as well as your environmental leadership with focusing on the environment on the east end of Long Island. So thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 210 with Bob DeLuca. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.